Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third day of our summer seminar on research integrity. The first day, we homed in on individual researchers and research integrity. Yesterday, we talked about the role of universities and other research institutions in fostering research integrity. Today's topic is the role of journals and other stakeholders in research integrity. Another action-packed day. We are here live streaming from Amsterdam in Pakhuis de Zwijger. Unfortunately, still virtually live streaming. I mean, you're all still here virtually with us today, so we're excited about that. It would have been nicer if we had all been here physically, but it was not to be. But welcome nonetheless. We have 7 speakers today. And 4 pitches. So there's a slight change in the program that I'd like to alert you to. Unfortunately, Sarah de Rijke couldn't make it today. She couldn't deliver her talk. But we switched her spot out for Anna Marusic, who is going to speak later in the day. So you'll see the program on your screen. So Anna Marusic will speak today at noon instead of Sarah de Rijke, and then the program will finish a little bit earlier. So we'll finish the program with the panel discussion at the end of the day, but it will be earlier than the original program said. So there's that. So there's, as the previous 2 days, we have coffee breaks, lunch breaks, so that all speaks for itself. We are, the Q&A will be done through the chats. Sorry, I'm confused here. So there's a chat function and there's a Q&A function. If you want to ask questions about the talks, please use the Q&A function. If you want to chat with each other, use the chat function. The questions will be moderated by our online moderator today, Iris Lechner, who's here with us. You can't see her, but she's working really hard to make everything run smoothly. All right, enough said. Let me introduce our first speaker for today. And I think he's speaking for the 3rd time, or at least you would have been able to see him yesterday and the day before, so he hardly needs any introduction. But Lex Bouter is Professor of Methodology and Integrity at the Vrije University in Amsterdam and the Amsterdam University Medical Centers. And his topic for this morning is an overview of other research integrity stakeholders. So Lex, without further ado, the floor and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jeroen. And indeed, my task is to talk about the other stakeholders. Like Jeroen already told you, the first day was devoted to researchers mainly, the second day to funding agencies and also research institutes, and today is for scholarly journals and also the publishers. But there are other stakeholders, and I will mention them, but I will smuggle a little bit as well, because I will mainly talk about retractions and their importance. And the purpose of that is to bring that on the floor, because I believe it is important, and also to provoke a little bit the Q&As and maybe also the talks that will follow today, because retractions is not a very visible element in the program so far. Now, these other stakeholders, I take 3 of them: governments, learned societies, and the media. Starting with the governments, and countries differ quite a lot. Some countries have laws, have acts or bills, like they call them in North America, or other types of regulations covering research integrity. Most countries nowadays do have laws for doing research with animals and humans, the research ethics side, but not that many countries have laws for research integrity. There are pros and cons of that, of course, that's obvious. When you have a law, you can punish a bit more severely, and that is what these countries do as well, for instance in Scandinavia and the USA, China as well. But when you don't have these laws, there is more room for talking freely about your errors and dilemmas. So there is a trade-off there. Governments can also pose conditions on direct funding of universities, for instance, and research institutes that have to do with research integrity. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. And that happens in some countries and in other countries not at all. There is also the indirect route, of course. They can forward money to national research councils or medical research councils and then pose the condition, make sure that the research integrity is covered and that everyone abides to the European Code of Conduct on Research Integrity, for instance. That happens also on the European level. Now, some countries do have national committees and others don't, national committees for research integrity. When countries do have a national committee, it can be twofold, to simplify a little bit. Some have direct access. So for the severe complaints, you can go directly for the national committee and skip local committees in universities. And other countries, the national committee is only an appeal organization. And in our country, we like to play it democratically and complex, of course. We haven't even an appeal committee. They are only giving a second opinion in the Netherlands, the national committee. And that works quite well, I should say. You can do it in different ways correctly, I believe. The learned societies, and I must admit that I had no clue what learned societies did on the plane of research integrity. I have been involved, I'm originally an epidemiologist, in the Code of Conduct for epidemiologists concerning research integrity. But now we have a really interesting master thesis student working on what's happening in learned societies. And it turns out that many have code of conducts or documents which are similar. Some learned societies, and we focus on the EU, but it might be similar in other continents, they have conditions for membership apply that have to do with research integrity. Disciplinary councils happen. It's quite rare, but it happened in learned societies. And the advantage is, of course, that many of these research integrity issues, where you want to know for sure what it is about, it needs to be specified for the specific disciplinary field in which you are. And learned societies can do that quite well. Some offer education, typically e-learning, of course, and a few offer certification. So they seem to pick up their role to make it work, research integrity, from the disciplinary angle. Second one, the media. The media are a stakeholder in research integrity, and they can be powerful. The regular media, like television, big newspapers, magazines, and what have you. Sometimes Nature and Science have that. That is part scientific journal, part medicine with journalists. They are powerful. But also the social media, and we've seen that especially in the COVID pandemic, of course, they can influence the public opinion strongly and be a whistleblower on research integrity. In fact, we talked about that yesterday, anonymous whistleblowers can go to the media and enter websites and newspapers in the anonymous mode, and then you can get trial by media. It's all over the place, no investigation has been conducted, and you are convicted already in the eye of the public. And the media also, they can do good things and bad things. There are reputational risks connected for individuals, for institutions, also for universities and funding agencies specifically. And there is one recent thing that happened yesterday. In Australia, a big research funder decided that preprints were not allowed in grant applications of people, early career scientists applying for a career grant. That's a bloody shame, of course. Nature wrote about it. The whole world is now in turmoil, and I really hope that they will change that bad policy quickly, possibly overnight, because this is so disadvantage for early careers researchers. Many of them only have preprints to show what they can. So the media can play a role for the good and for the bad. So far, the other stakeholders. We skipped that. We couldn't offer you 5 days of conference, and we stick to 2 days. The second thing is retraction, and that's my main topic. Retraction is really an important topic, and the main purpose is cleaning the published track record of poor, fraudulent, deadly biased research. It should be clean and it should be removed. It's not removed in the sense that you cannot see it anymore. Typically, you get something like this, and this is, we talked about it earlier, Diederik Stapel retraction, one of his papers that was retracted, and that is clearly indicated as retracted. You can see it. This is the way you see it on the website of the journal. That doesn't happen always that clear. And this is an example from the COVID pandemic time. You had many retractions during the COVID pandemic. About 160 is the count. That sounds like a lot, but it's still somewhere between 1 and 5 promille of the number of papers published, which is rather typical. I'll show you a slide later on, that between 1 or up to 3, 4, 5 in thousands of the papers are retracted. Possibly more papers should be retracted, but this is what happens currently. But this case, the French guy, Didier Raoul, he published first a preprint and then a paper saying that a anti-malaria drug, hydroxychloroquine, was also good in treating COVID-19 patients. The problem was that it was a poor study. 24 patients, he left out a lot of them, and that was helpful in getting the answer he wanted to have. There were all types of irregularities in the data. It was a mess. And it was detected, there was Twitter storms about it, a lot of stuff, but the damage was done already by then. Because one of the former president of the US, I'm not going to mention his name, of course, he took the drug, he advertised the drug, and he said, wow, this is a miracle cure. We should buy the whole stock and give it to our American patients. Well, that is more or less what they did, but it was not working at all. And then the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, the top journals in the biomedical field, they published both papers based on search sphere data, showing that the stuff, when it does something, it has harmful side effects, even also among COVID patients. It doesn't cure them at all. And the embarrassing thing was that these data were also flawed. So these papers were retracted as well. So it was a mess. And what is different in the COVID pandemic, this all happened in a few weeks, 2 months at most. Normally, it takes years to get a paper retracted, but now it was accelerated enormously. So we learned a lot about preprints, about peer review, about retractions in that pandemic. This is an older thing, biomedical mainly, but not exclusively. It's 15 years old. Someone needs to repeat this study. It's really interesting. It shows that the top journals, in terms of impact factor, if you still believe in that, have more retractions. You see on the top, Science, Nature, Cell, New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet. These are the top journals. One might wonder, why do they have more retractions? I don't know. The stakes are higher in big journals, so people cut corners more easily when the stakes are high, maybe. The journals are more vigilant, maybe. They are awfully rich, they have large staffs, and they can investigate cases. Other journals typically not. And they might be better organized and faster in response, because the stakes for the journal at issue, their reputations are higher as well. I don't know. I want to say that Retraction Watch, it's an interesting blog website, they look at retractions. And this is from the Retraction Watch leaderboard. It's the list of infamous authors with a lot of retractions. Our Diederik Stapel, I mentioned before, is number 6 on the leaderboard with 58 retractions. Now, some of you might not even have 58 scientific papers, but he has 58 retractions. It's really a record, a sad record, I should say. And Retraction Watch does something else as well. It's wonderful. They have a Retraction Watch database now, and they collect all the retractions of the last decades, and they go back as far as they can in the literature. And they have now 25,000 plus retractions. You see on this slide, it's a bit in small print. When you type in Diederik Stapel, you get a number of 58, and you get all the papers of Diederik that are retracted. Now this is a source for research, There are a few groups worldwide, one in Rio de Janeiro. They're doing solid research on retractions on the basis of the retraction database. Really interesting assets for evidence-based research on research integrity. This is biomedical research as well, that retractions are predominantly investigated in that domain. Time trends, you see number of retractions are growing, both in open access journals and in PubMed indexed regular journals. You see on the right side that it is again somewhere between 1 to 3 per mil is the number compared to the number of publications. It's growing, and that is likely a good thing. It's not, I don't believe that the fact that it's growing, it's showing that it's going worse and worse and worse in academia. We pay attention more and more and more. That would be my theory, but not that much research has been done on that as well. And in the same article, they looked at the reasons for retraction. That was important as well, the reason for retractions. There are many of them, of course. Plagiarism is a big one. Fraud and suspected fraud is one. Faked review is a big one, which is spectacular. Some of you may know that, of course, but in a number of countries, they have the habit, when a journal asks you to mention a reviewer, to mention a famous person, but also to mention a fake email address of that person that goes to you. So then you can write your own reviews. And, well, you can be really nice to yourself. That's an opportunity, of course. So this was a scandal. It seems to be going down, but it's still a problem. When you look at this distribution, I don't have the time to dwell too long on it, you see that, for instance, in China and Iran, that's the orange stuff, the fakes review is rather large. And also, you see that plagiarism, that's the green one, is varying between countries quite substantially. So there are differences between cultures, between countries, between continents. We all have our own problems, and we need to solve them as well. Retraction guidelines you can find on the COPE website, the Committee on Publication Ethics, a really interesting organization that is catering for journals and publishers mainly, but they have beautiful checklists and guidelines on everything connected with publication. Please have a look if you don't have seen it before. Finally, about these retractions, a list of all the problems. Journals are slow, they're really slow. Journals are reluctant. Authors, they need to agree or not to agree to retraction. Some journals think that. Cleaning journals from flawed articles or sanction for research misconduct, that is the main thing. I started with that. I believe that we should clean the record and don't wait until someone is convicted for research integrity. That might take years. You should withdraw the paper within days, and that's not yet happening. The description of retractions are not that well. It's important to do that better. Probably lawyers are involved and they want to prevent lawsuits, so legal advisors say keep it a bit vague in these notices, which is not nice, not for research, but also not for researchers. You want to know why retraction is there. And one problem is, two problems. One problem is that honorable retractions, so when I discover an error in one of my papers, which happened last year, I want that paper to be corrected or retracted. But I don't want to be on the pile of people who are convicted for research misconduct. I discovered it myself, and I want to repair the record. So you need to have a clear badge for honorable retractions, I believe. And the other weird thing is that retractions are still cited so often. Bit less than before they are retracted, but not much less. And why is that? I make the same error. You have a pile of PDFs in your computer, and you use that or a more sophisticated system to make your reference list. You never go back to the original website of the journal, and there you can see it is retracted. You cannot see it in the pile in your notebook. Luckily, now there is software that can check whether papers in the reference list have been retracted, and increasingly journals are using that. Finally, really finally, Jeroen, I'd like to point to a very special person, Elizabeth Big. She is a kind of detective of photo manipulation. You have Western blots photos and other types of photos in biomedical papers. And these are in fact the data. That is what you use to base your conclusion on. And it's quite easy to Photoshop it a little bit to make it more nice, to recycle parts of other pictures of yourself or of others. You do that within papers, between papers, anything. And this lady, Elizabeth Bith, she is so good at detecting that. In the reference, and when you see the presentation PDF, you get the reference. There is the paper in the New Yorker, describing what she does and how she does it. And I mention her here because she has the estimate that 4% of the paper which have photos, meaning data in biomedical papers, 4% are flawed. So, and that is data falsification. And it might also be plagiarism when you grab a picture of someone else. 4% is her estimate, and that is a lot. And she stopped writing to publishers and journals. She only published it on papier because she is so disappointed that journals don't react or react so slowly. And papier is a wonderful platform that is publishing it in an anonymous mode if you want. You can also have a named mode and have a nice extension of your web browser. When you install it, when you look at the paper and paper has something on it, plop, you see it on the screen. So journals and publishers don't like that because you are hijacking their websites in a way, but it is a way for post-publication peer review. It is a way for mentioning research integrity problems like photo manipulation. Now the good news is, small advertisement, on October 13, Elizabeth Big and also Boris Barber, he is running the PIP here, will both present a webinar on these things from this same spot organized by the Netherlands Research Integrity Network. And with that, I would like to close. Jeroen.
Thank you so much, Lex. This was a pretty spectacular guided tour in the dark side of science. So really fascinating. So if you have questions, you can pose them through the Q&A. I see a number of questions are already pouring in. So let me ask the first one. It's from Roberto Buccione. The retraction watch correlation between journal impact factor and retraction rate is heavily contaminated by many confounding factors, one of which is the fact that the so-called lower tier journals publish a higher number of articles that will never ever be read by anyone, and therefore no one will find out about anything, apart from Elizabeth Big, perhaps. So yes, vigilance may be a factor, but probably by the scientific community heavily scrutinizing articles of higher interest and not so much by the journals. What do you think about this?
It's completely right. It's true. Many articles are probably never read. Most articles are certainly never cited. So who cares, you could say. You can fantasize until the cows come home, but it's not really important and impressive. So that is true, and in a technical sense, yes, that is confounding. And that is why I plea for new, more multidimensional, multifactorial research in the arena. We don't understand a lot of it. And this is a general thing. Research on research integrity is still in its infancy. It was completely absent maybe 5 or 10 years ago, or really tiny, and it's growing enormously thanks for the European Union and the national research body funding in this type of research. But there is so much obvious, interesting, important questions that have never been researched, and this is one of them.
That sounds plausible. So another thing I was wondering about myself, so a number of years ago, a Dutch newspaper, as you know, of course, NRC did they wrote an investigative journalism piece about the peer review process at Nature, I think it was, or Science, a high impact journal. And one of the things they found was that, in fact, in the review criteria that are sent to reviewers, things like impact or possible relevance, sexiness, if you will, are in fact deemed more important than methodological soundness. And that might factor into why these high impact journals get more attractions eventually also. Is that, I mean, do you know if anything has changed in sort of the review criteria? Is there more scrutiny now, or is this still going on, you think?
Well, to answer this correctly, it would take another 1-hour lecture, but the point is, selective reporting is there. Selection by reviewers and editors is there. And the selection, that's the awful thing, is not whether the question is relevant and the research has been done sound. No, the selection is mainly on the nature of the results and the nature of the answer and the findings. And that leads to publication bias. And that is not, well, Nature can do that, and New England Journal can do that. I don't mind that much, as long as the stuff is published. And we are now in the business of solving that by registered reports. There has been a lot of talk about it yesterday. That's a real killer of publication bias. And the open journals, like British Medical Journal Open, PLOS ONE, to some extent Nature Communications as well, they publish everything which is okay, relevant and well done. Don't look at the nature of the results, because they are flexible. They don't mind. It's not more costly to publish 100,000 papers or 10,000 papers. They're digital anyway. So we are in the business of solving this, but the real killer of selective reporting and also of selecting of publication bias is the registered report we talked about yesterday.
Yeah. Do you see any indication that the high impact journals are adopting those?
Reluctantly,
yeah.
Reluctantly. Well, you talk to these people, and they're right, of course. They are newspapers in the sense, scientific newspapers. So they go for the spectacular stuff, yeah. And that's not bad, as long as the rest of the stuff is findable.
Sure, yeah. It affects their business model, that's clear, yeah. So a question from Iris. We talked about second chances in academia yesterday during the panel. After convictions of research misconduct. So how do you feel about second chances in relation to retractions, especially when it's maybe sort of second, third authors who might not be the key wrongdoers?
Well, this is an interesting question. The point is, of course, that a retraction in the mind of many people is a punishment for poor behavior. I would say that is true, but it's not the whole thing. The main thing is to clean the published track record as quickly as possible. And yes, co-authors are also co-guilty. The regular criteria is that when you want to be an author, there is a price to pay, namely that you are responsible for what is being published. Now, some journals now have qualified authorships, and then you can say, well, I have no clue what happened in the laboratory, but I was involved in the design and writing of the paper and data collection. That is okay, as long as it's done before you're caught in a flawed paper. Afterwards, it doesn't count anymore, of course. So, and yes, rehabilitation, retraction, well, none of my papers have been retracted. A few of them have been corrected. I'm still in business, and I hope that you agree that I'm still in business. Of course, there need to be second chances there. It's not all or nothing. Yeah. And also in criminal law, stealing something small and killing someone, there is a range of severity there. Also in research integrity infringement.
Yeah, clearly. Thanks. So perhaps a final question from Rika Ziedlau. What do you think of the danger in open platforms like Papier making false accusations, intentionally or not, especially if comments are not removed from these platforms?
Well, that's a good point. It's a good point. Also, Mariette van der Hoven yesterday in the panel discussion, she said, well, I'm not so sure I like Retraction Watch, she said about Retraction Watch, because they are in the business of naming and shaming, often before any investigation has been concluded. Now, in favor of Retraction Watch, I would like to say, I know of no cases they had it wrong, but they are a bit early sometimes, that's true, so they run a risk. And also with Papier, they are sued for what they're doing by journals, by individuals. I've been discussing with Boris Barber, the guy even on that runs Papier, even on Twitter, whether anonymous complaints is such a good idea. I believe there should be a room for it, but it should be discouraged as much as possible. Because we talked about yesterday anonymous complaints are awkward because you cannot talk to the complainant. And the complainant doesn't run, as long as the anonymity is there, doesn't run any risks. So you can just throw something on a website and it can be slander. You will never be published for it, and it will endanger the career of someone else, which is not nice at all, of course.
Not nice at all. I agree with that, for sure, yeah. We're out of time, so thank you very much, Lex, for another wonderful talk. And please give Lex a virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
So that brings us to the second speaker of the day, and in fact, I just realized that I didn't actually properly introduce myself when I began this morning. So for those of you who haven't seen me yesterday, I'm Jeroen de Ridder. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and also one of the people involved in the larger project on epistemic progress in the university, of which this seminar is one output. But enough about me. So let's introduce the next speaker. His name is Joshua Habgood-Coote. He is joining us today on Zoom from Leeds, I believe, where he is a research fellow in the Grounds Project in the School of Philosophy, Religion and History of Science. His work is mainly in social epistemology and philosophy of language, so Josh is a philosopher. And today he is going to talk about the question what the point is of authorship, and I assume that the talk will be at least partly based on a paper of his that's been published in the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, so if you're interested you can check out the paper for yourself. So Josh, thanks for joining us today, happy to have you here, and without further ado, the screen is yours.
Excellent, thanks, Jeroen. I'm just gonna see if I can get this going. Brilliant. Okay, that looks like it's working. Is that working your end?
Looks good.
Okay, excellent. So thanks for the introduction, Jeroen, and thanks for having me. Thanks for being here, everyone. So yeah, my name is Josh Habgood-Coote, and I'm going to talk today about what the point of authors is. So whereas Yuri's talk yesterday or the day before was more about the kind of practical issues involved in managing authorship disagreements from kind of individual scientists, my talk today is going to be a bit more at the kind of policy level, a bit more at the level of journals. So I'm going to be thinking a bit more about some of the conceptual work which is done by authorship, like what kind of like things it's doing for the collective process of science, and then thinking a little bit about how authorship guidelines might be crafted so that they can kind of meet those kinds of functions. Okay, so I want to start off by asking a slightly facetious question. And the question is how many physicists it takes to write a paper. So this is a paper from Physical Review Letters. Hopefully you can see kind of at least the kind of grammar of what's on the front page of this paper. So this is a paper from 2015, and it's a combined measurement of the Higgs boson's mass in pp collisions at blah, blah, doesn't matter. It's an improved measurement of the mass of Higgs bosons, and it's a paper that came out of CERN. It's an interesting paper because it comes out of both projects at CERN. It comes out of both the ATLAS project and the CMS collaboration. So they often work separately, but they work together on this paper. Now, if you've got good screen resolution or really good eyesight, one of the things you'll notice is that there's a kind of single author on the top of this paper, G. Ad, and then little et al. Immediately underneath the name of the two collaborations. Next to the et al. Is a small asterisk, and the asterisk takes you to the end of the paper. So there were too many authors to list on the front page, so they put the authors right at the end of the paper. There's a long list with a set of complicated further asterisks indicating where people are at, and some other details. So the list goes on, took up 4 pages, 8, and I think overall there's 14 pages of authors here, all extremely meticulously annotated with where they've come from, which project they're on. A number of the authors of the paper are deceased at the time of publication as well. And there's something kind of puzzling about this, especially if you're someone who comes from a humanities discipline where papers are often singly authored, or a discipline where papers are authored by just one or two people. And you might think that something's gone terribly wrong here, right? That CERN, this like massive scientific institution at the forefront of scientific discovery, has like really abused authorship, or something has gone something really, really badly wrong here. All of these people can't have possibly worked on the project. And if you dig in a little bit, it turns out, yeah, that's right. And CERN are pretty straightforward about this. They have an authorship policy where everyone who works on a project gets authorship credit on all papers. And all you need to do is have worked on the project for a certain amount of time. So lots of people who are authors on this paper won't have read it, might not be aware of this paper, probably not for this one because it's quite a well-known paper, but if you talk to a high-energy physicist, they'll say something like, yeah, some of the old school people, they do read all their papers, but for me, I've just got papers kind of like stacking up on my Google Scholar, and I don't read them because it would take all my time to read all my papers. Okay, so I don't want to pick on high-energy physics here. I think there's something kind of reasonable going on here. There's a large-scale collaboration. Lots of effort will be taken to collect data on exactly who's worked on what, and they've come up with a policy to kind of manage that data while making sure that everyone working on the project is credited. What I think this example does show is there's a kind of like emerging crisis going on in authorship in science. And that crisis is as the size of collaborations gets bigger, and as the number of authors increases, and the number of papers which are authored also increases, the status of authorship is increasingly coming under conceptual strain, right? It's being used to do a lot of work, and it's not clear whether it actually can do all of that work. And what we see across lots of different disciplines is increasingly divergent ways of handling authorship. This in high energy physics is maybe one kind of extreme way of handling authorship, but you can see different disciplines starting to go off in their own different ways. Okay, so there's a bunch of kind of problems which are overlapping, which are often discussed in research ethics connected with authorship. So there's issues about people being confused or getting into disagreements that are ultimately kind of futile about what the norms are for assigning positions on the byline. When you come into discipline, you think, oh, it must be clear, there are a set of rules. And once you start to talk to people from a bunch of different disciplines, you realize people are handling it lots of different ways. And when you get into an interdisciplinary collaboration, often a really important disagreement is about whose discipline's authorship norms should be used. There's also big problems about flouting of disciplinary norms, often which is enabled by this very unclarity. Right? It's not clear like what the system of ordering is. Is it like who needs the publication most, who's done the most work, who's most senior, who believes the result the most, who supervised the work? It's going to get really easy to see how abuse can start to happen. There's also prevalence of ghost authors. So this is a term coined in medical sciences to talk about researchers who've written a paper but are then left off the byline, typically because they're working for a pharmaceutical company, and leaving them off the byline means that you don't have to acknowledge the support of or the association with that company. And it looks like ghost authors are pretty common. There's, I'm forgetting the figure now, it's something like 30% or 50% in this Wislar paper of papers look like they have ghost authors. That should come with a big caveat, go check the paper. Yeah, we get into these irresolvable disagreements. And from the author's side as well, right, from the reader's side as well, right, you start to get like massive problems in like reading a byline as soon as you start to read outside of your discipline. Okay, so engaging with the theme today of thinking about how research integrity interacts with journals, I want to just reflect for a second on like whose problem this is. So right, Yuri was talking about how this is a problem for researchers. They end up getting into debates about how to negotiate their bylines and into difficult issues about who gets recognized most for which bit of work. It's also a problem for journals, right? They're dealing with abuses of authorship, and looks like increasingly journals are expected to and should have pre-set out policies for how people should assign authorship. It's also going kind of ascending levels of complexity within science. It's a big issue for disciplines, right? If disciplines want to make sure that they're fairly spreading credit, and the issues about priority of discoveries, which are often associated with publication, who gets to be authors on the paper. Then disciplines ought to be able to manage their authorship practices within a discipline, and kind of ascending just to the level of science in general, as we'll see a bit later on in the talk, there's actually a real important sense in which authorship actually matters for the collective progress of science overall. It plays an important role in incentivizing research, that's like efficient and is going to get the most out of the researchers we got. Okay, so just kind of returning to the theme that there's a kind of crisis in authorship, there's a number of proposals out there to kind of reform authorship. They take a number of different forms. So there's proposals to allow collective authors, to abandon authorship completely, to regiment authorship. So there's the ICJME guidelines and the contributor roles taxonomy guidelines. We're going to come back to them a bit later on. There's proposals to randomize the byline of papers, to supplement authorship with contribution statements, or to now allow pseudonymous authorship. So some of these proposals are like out there. Not sure anyone's fully like abandoned authorship, but it's not it's not like there's a consensus about which of these is the right way to go, and several of them have often been combined together. So medical journals both have contribution statements and regiment authorship as well. Okay, so this is the kind of position we're in. Authorship looks like it's in a position of a bit of a mess. There's some ongoing crises that are causing people, scientific disciplines and science trouble. And there's a question about how authorship can be organized, and more concretely, like this question of, for a particular paper, who should be an author on it? Okay, so here's what I'm going to try and do today in the rest of this 45 minutes. So my central question today is going to be what the point of authorship is, what the functions of authorship are in the kind of collective process of science. Okay, and I'm going to be arguing that authorship plays a bunch of different functions. It's involved in allocating credit, constructing a kind of speaker for a paper, in enabling credibility judgments, supporting accountability, and creating what I'm going to call an intellectual marketplace. Okay, now I'm going to argue that no one status, no singular status of authorship, kind of that we're going to assign people a status or not, can simultaneously play all of these functions. And if you want something to play all these functions, we're going to get into problems where in certain cases, we're going to want to say both that someone is and isn't an author. And I'm going to kind of lay out a speculative proposal, which I'm going to call the SWG proposal, which is that journals should replace authors, get rid of authors, and replace them with 4 different statuses: contributors, spokespeople, writers, and guarantors. Okay, so this is partly a philosophy paper. It's also partly a policy paper at a very abstract level. So there's 2 kinds of parts going on. There's a kind of conceptual claim about like what the functions of authorship are, which we'll get in the first section. A claim about some of the tensions going on, conceptual tensions about authorship, and then this proposal that's going to happen at the end, right? So you can, by the first, you can think that I'm right about the conceptual functions of authorship, while thinking that, no, there's some problems with this like proposal, maybe it's just too complicated or something like that. But even if you think that, I hope that there's some kind of, the picture of the functions of authorship can help you to think about what the, what's the issue in debates about who should be an author on paper. Okay, 2 quick clarifications, because it wouldn't be a philosophy paper without some caveats. So throughout, I'm going to be using science as a kind of general stand-in for like academic research. So Wissenschaft, or I think in Dutch, the inclusive word is Wetenschap. Apologies for terrible pronunciation. And I'm going to talk throughout as well as if authorship were a social status, not a kind of status determined by what research you actually did, right? So I'm going to be assuming that a byline, people get listed on the front page of a paper, that confers, that makes them the author of the paper. It doesn't describe their status of authorship. So that means that if someone's left off the byline of a paper, they aren't an author, although perhaps they should be an author. Okay, that's just for clarity and consistency. Nothing important really turns on that. Okay, good. So first I'm going to talk about the functions of authorship, then I'm going to give you the problem cases, then we're going to run through the proposal to reform authorship. Okay, so let's start off with the functions. Okay, so we've seen these kind of already previewed, but I'll just run through these and kind of motivate each of these functions, thinking about a bunch of different issues that open up how we might want to think about authorship. Okay, so the first function of authorship is to allocate credit for an intellectual achievement. Okay, so there's an important sense in which kind of scientific papers serve to mark achievements in science, right? They serve to mark like discoveries, important new additions to the body of scientific knowledge. Right? A scientific paper can't be like, well, I mean, this is some of the issues about like replications, but like, at least in one sense, we want to say that like you can't publish a scientific paper that just like makes the same claim as other people have made in the past, unless it's in the special case of replication. Okay, so scientific papers mark discovery, and then we might think what happens with authorship is a way of allocating credit for that intellectual achievement, right? So when a group of people have brought about an achievement together, authorship is like drawing a line around the group of people who are responsible for that achievement. Okay, now, so that's a kind of conceptual point about discovery. Another way into thinking about this is by thinking about cases in which people are left off authorship and what goes wrong when people are kind of wrongly left off the byline. So there's a bunch of different cases here. Like there's a lot of very well-known cases of people being left off the byline. I'm going to talk just quickly about an example from the history of science. So Chapin, in his work on invisible technicians, talks about early modern science and the way in which lots of early modern scientific experimental setups were involved in a gentleman scientist who had a massive team of laborants who'd work around them. And the laborants would do most of the kind of like actual work and the observations and the running of the machines. And then the gentleman scientist would write everything up under their own name. So there's a lovely illustration here on the slide from Chapin's paper. This is of Otto van Guyrik's air pump. We see the air pump at the top, the kind of important scientific stuff, and then at the bottom, the workers who are running the air pump, who are depicted as faceless, their hats covering their eyes, and they're kind of almost as if they're merely parts of the scientific machine that's carrying things on. Right, we might think something's gone wrong here, right? These people are also responsible, at least in part, for the intellectual achievement, and by being left off, they've been denied credit that's due to them. Okay, so there's some systematic phenomena in the background here. So there's the Matthew effect introduced by the sociologist Robert Merton, which is about the phenomena of people who are both put on the byline, one getting more credit than the other because they're better known. That seems like it's bad for the same reason, right? Like the better known person isn't due more credit, but they're getting more. There's also the Matilda effect introduced by Margaret Rossiter, kind of as a knowing kind of nod to the Matthew effect, which is about the phenomenon of women being left off systematically from bylines. And there's a kind of interesting connection up to some recent work in epistemology about the ways in which people are disbelieved and denied credit for what they know. So there's some there's a kind of important body here, a body of literature here about epistemic injustice, people being denied the kind of full exercise of their epistemic agency, epistemic oppression, and epistemic appropriation, right? The kind of knowledge that people have being appropriated from them and ascribed to other people. Okay, so looks like when people get left off the byline kind of inappropriately, at least one of the things that goes wrong is they're denied credit that they're due. Okay, so there's some tricky kind of conceptual issues here, right? So there's some issues in saying exactly what the achievement of a paper is, right? Is it the thing which is discovered? Well, that would mean that credit was also due to the people who have gone before, who've done work which the paper builds on. So we might want to say that the discovery is a kind of increment, the increase in scientific knowledge. Otherwise, like everyone who's worked in the field is going to get on as an author on every new paper. There's issues about how we think about what kind of achievement is involved in scientific discovery, whether it's a specifically intellectual achievement or a kind of practical achievement. I'm not going to argue for this, but I think there's a good reason to say that we shouldn't be drawing this distinction at all. There isn't an important distinction here, and that we should be a lot more capacious in who gets assigned credit. And there's a kind of issue here which people will be familiar with if they've negotiated authorship disputes about what counts as a significant contribution, right? I'm not going to assume that significant contribution means very much, because I think that's often determined by context, right? What counts as significant. Okay, so this gives us our first function. So assigning someone the status of an author on a paper is a way to attribute to them full or partial credit for the intellectual achievements of that paper. Okay, second function. So this is constructing a speaker. So start with a different idea about publication. So we might think the publication is a special kind of assertion. It's a way of putting forward a claim as true. It's a special kind of assertion because it's written rather than spoken. So it's a bit different from me saying that it's kind of grey outside because it's England. And it's also special because it's institutionally authorized, right? So a journal has to give permission to a set of authors to put forward a set of claims as true in their journal, right? Okay, so if publication is a special kind of assertion, then we might think that it inherits some of the general features of assertion from kind of like ordinary spoken discourse, right? And one of the features of assertion in general, which epistemologists have spent a lot of time thinking about, and philosophers of language, is the way that assertion generates obligations, so kind of intellectual and in some way like kind of conversational obligations as well. So here's a kind of set of obligations which are popular in literature and epistemology and philosophy of language. So people think there's a sincerity norm on assertion, so you should only say something if you believe it. There's kind of consistency and coherence norms. As you go on saying things through a conversation, you better be consistent in what you say and form a coherent whole. There's a defend and retract norm. So if you put something as true, then you're committed to defending it, or if you're not going to defend it, to take that claim back. And there's also a knowledge norm, which says that you should only assert something if you know that it's true. Okay, so if these are the kind of normative features of assertion, then we might think they're also features of the special kind of institutionally authorized assertion in publication, right? And it turns out like that looks like a pretty good hypothesis. So we might think that one thing that goes wrong when people publish fraudulently is that they express claims they don't believe. One of the issues that goes on with writing, especially writing with co-author teams, there's a lot of issues about like how you make it all of the paper coherent if different people have written on it. The defend and retract norm looks like it relates pretty closely to some of the issues about scholarly retraction, which Lex was just talking about. So if you put forward a claim as true in a scientific journal, then under certain conditions, you've got to either defend it or retract it. And the defense maybe happens more in the corresponding author than in kind of responses to other papers. And we might also think there's a kind of like connection here, although this is a little bit more murky, between the idea that you should know the claims you make and the kind of like evidence which one ought to have as a scientist. Okay, so looks kind of plausible that some of these norms are also going to apply to authors, the set of authors that are on a paper. So here's an idea that I want to take forward, which is that one thing that goes on when we construct an author list is that we're constructing a speaker who can take up these kinds of intellectual responsibilities. So this isn't backward looking like the credit function. This is more about constructing a speaker who can kind of fulfill prospective intellectual obligations. Now there's a really murky issue here about who these obligations should apply to. Do they all apply to all of the authors? Do they apply in a distributed way when different parts of the obligations apply to different people? Do they apply to just one, or do they apply to the collective? Okay, I'm not going to resolve that here, but I'm going to come back to it later. Okay, so this gets us a second function. So a function of assigning a set of people as the authors, sorry, the typo there, of a paper is to create a epistemically, intellectually responsible speaker. Okay, third function. So this is about credibility judgments. Okay, so some of the issues that Michael was talking about on Wednesday were about like some of the issues around preprints and whether preprints are trustworthy and how preprints maybe differ from published results in journals. So it's a question for a reader of science, like when you should trust things that you read in a journal paper. It's especially important if you're reading outside of your kind of scholarly expertise, so you can't go through and kind of verify the argument if you're just looking for, does this conclusion look right? And you can't work through the reasons. So there are a bunch of ways in which you can determine whether you should trust results. So you can look at what journal it's in, the university authors come from, the method and whether there's open science badges, the lab reputation. Maybe you rely just on peer review and community checking to have verified the result, or you might just be like skeptical about all the results you read. So there's a big complicated story here about how we determine whether we should trust results, but at least part of the story is that individual authors, by putting themselves on a paper, are putting up their kind of credibility for the results, right? And you see some kind of funny cases here where often some of the point of putting on like a senior scientist onto a paper is to ensure that people read it and people take it seriously because they are giving it like the credibility with maybe its due. Okay, so just as with the construction of a speaker, there's a bunch of complicated issues here about whose credibility matters. Is it the lead author? Is it the average of credibility rankings we should take, the highest, the lowest, the journal's ranking, or the lab's ranking? Right? Complicated issues here, which are I'm not going to fully resolve, but I'm going to say a bit more about at the end. Okay, so this gives us a third function, that a function of assigning a set of people as the authors of the paper is to enable readers to make judgments about how credible the results of that paper are. Okay, fourth function, so this is about accountability. Okay, so one thing, I guess this is not controversial to say in a seminar on research integrity. One thing that's important is having research which is accountable to the community. Now, one reason I think this is important is that a certain kind of well-calibrated community pressure within a community of inquiry can provide a certain kind of practical reason which incentivize people to do better research, right? So if you know that you're going to get certain kinds of negative reactions and certain kinds of censure if you publish bad research, it's a kind of practical bad consequence, then you've got a reason to kind of do more research to make sure that you get above the line of like what counts as good research. Okay, so we might think here that just as in the moral domain, the kind of attitudes which we have to one another of what Strawson calls kind of reactive attitudes of like praise and blame that give people reasons to act morally. Similarly, what Deborah Tollison calls the intellectual reactive attitudes, kind of intellectual censure and praise, give people reasons to do better research, right? Okay, so there's a way in which accountability leads to better research, and we want to make sure that the right people are being held accountable. Okay, so again, we've got the same kinds of issues here. Who should be accountable? Is it all the authors, one? Is it a distributed phenomenon, or is it the collective? Again, I'm not going to resolve that kind of question. One point to just pick up here, and this is pulling on some joint work that I've done with Hyson Dang, is that one of the issues about anonymous authorship, so this is associated with the proposals in the Journal of Controversial Ideas, which lets authors publish anonymously or under a pseudonym. So one of the issues with that kind of proposal is that it removes this important feature of the kind of intellectual accountability, which is really important for making sure that research is good, right? Research is responsible. Okay, good. So this is our fourth function. A function of assigning a set of people as the authors of the paper is to create a target for praise if the paper is epistemic good, and censure if it's bad, and thus push up the standards within the intellectual community. Okay, final function, there's 5 of them because authorship is complicated, and that's the function of creating an intellectual marketplace. Okay, so here's a hopefully uncontroversial claim that science aims to produce knowledge. Here's a puzzling phenomenon. So knowledge is a public good, right, in the sense of the economists like to talk about. So it's not rivalrous and it's not excludable, which means that you can't stop other people from using it if you've got knowledge, and you having knowledge doesn't stop other people from having knowledge. Okay. Now, the fact that knowledge is a public good means that it's going to lead to what economists call the public goods problem, which is that if individuals pursue it individually by themselves, they're not going to pursue it in the most efficient way, right? They're going to diverge from the most efficient way of inquiring. Now, one thought here is that in science, one way of managing the public goods problem is to take knowledge as a public good, but associate that public good with a private good, which is rivalrous and is excludable, which researchers are interested in getting hold of. And this private good is authorship, right? So authorship is associated with discovery. Discovery is excludable. If you discover something, then someone else can't discover it. And because of the way journals work, you being an author on a paper stops other people from. So it's also excludable, right? And why is that a good thing? Well, if there's a set of kind of private goods in an economic system, then we'll get the kind of familiar functions of the invisible hand to create an intellectual marketplace, which leads to both an efficient division of labor across different kind of scientific projects, and also to scientists like putting in kind of more intellectual efforts into their projects. So more labor is incentivized to be put in by scientists, and we get an efficient division of labor, right? So if you're kind of familiar with the work of like Adam Smith, you're getting some kind of sense of the invisible hand of science kind of playing some role in the background here. Right, so it looks like this is good for science collectively. There's a lot of issues here about how different amounts of credit is assigned, so not credit, but different accounts of this kind of good of authorship are assigned for co-authorship or individual authorship, and how that incentivizes people to pursue research projects by themselves or with others. Complicated issues there. Good, okay. So this is the market function that says that a function of assigning a set of people as the authors of a paper is to create a system of private goods which are apt for market mechanisms. Okay, good. So this is our set of functions of authorship. So to assign credit, to construct a speaker, to help readers to work out how credible results are, to enable accountability, and to create an intellectual marketplace. Okay, so that looks all good, right? These are all things we should want in science, but there's some problem cases, right? And these are 4 problem cases in which it looks like all these functions are going to point us in different directions about who should be an author. Okay, so here are the cases: disbelieving contributors, credibility manipulation, invisible technicians, and radically collaborative research. Okay. So the first case is a case of a large, or kind of, doesn't need to be large, or a small group of people who've worked together, put in a lot of work onto creating a data set and to doing some analysis of it. And then a smaller group of people, perhaps most of the group of people, decide that they can get some controversial result out of that data set. But there's one scientist in the group, let's say, who doesn't believe that result. Okay, so what should happen with authorship on the kind of paper that publishes that controversial result? Well, it looks like everyone's put in important credit-worthy work into producing the data set and to doing analysis on it. But by putting themselves up as an author on that paper, the disbelieving author is going to be maybe being disingenuous about what they believe, right? So credit looks like it pushes us one way, and issues about the responsibilities associated with being a speaker pushes another. Okay. Credibility manipulation. So this is Harriet Zuckerman, who was Robert Merton's wife, who did a bunch of interviews with Nobel-winning scientists. And there's an interesting bit which is quoted in Merton's paper on the Matthew effect, where she quotes a Nobel-winning scientist saying, "I got really het up, really confused about whether I should be an author on my students' papers, because if I'm an author on my students' papers, well, I get read and it will get taken seriously. But if I'm an author on their paper, because of the Matthew effect, I'm better known than they are, they're not going to get the credit that they're due, right? So it looks like you can put someone on the paper and that will help it get more credibility, maybe the credibility that is due, but that's going to mess up the credit allocations. So again, we've got a kind of like tension between different functions of authorship. Okay. Third kind of problem case is our invisible technicians. Again, Otto van Goerich's air pump here, right? So one point about invisible technicians is that they might not understand. They might not understand a lot of the scientific process which goes into producing results, and they might not be very credible in the intellectual economy at the time. One of the points of Chapin's A Social History of Truth is to say that only gentlemen in early modern England could be taken as credible, and invisible technicians weren't gentlemen. So if we want papers to get taken seriously, And for the intellectual kind of responsibilities associated with authorship to be fulfilled, we should leave invisible technicians off. But if we want credit, then credit to be fairly distributed, then we should want them on. Finally, in cases of what Hübner, Kuckler, and Winsberg call radically collaborative research, so massive distributed projects, so think of multi-site trials in medicine, like climate change research and high energy physics, it might be that no person is able to understand exactly like what's gone on in all of these different parts of this complex research process. And they, Hübner, Kuckler, and Winsberg, use that idea to argue that there should be no authors on radically collaborative research. And there's something kind of right about this, right? So no one can fulfill the intellectual responsibilities in these cases. And no one can be held accountable by themselves. Maybe even no group of people are capable of putting themselves up to be held accountable, but also there's a bunch of people who deserve credit, right? So here's what we've got. So there's a bunch of cases where it looks like we should both want to include and exclude people as authors, and the functions are pointing us in different ways, right? So credit is pointing us towards including people in all these cases, and other functions of authorship are pointing us away from including people. Okay, so third part of the paper. So I'm going to talk a bit about a proposal to reform authorship in a way that resolves some of these conceptual issues. Okay, so that's the kind of conceptual bit of the paper out of the way. This turns into a bit more of a policy proposal. Okay, so there are some options here, right? So we could pick a set of coherent functions for authorship and kind of drop some, and then design a set of authorship guidelines around those functions. So we could just take credit and say authorship is just about credit, it's not about all these other things, or say it's just about incentivizing research, it's not about all these other things, right? That would deal with these kinds of conflict cases. A second option would be to say, well, let's accept the inconsistency of the concept of authorship and allow individual scientists to handle the conflicts kind of by themselves on a kind of ad hoc basis, right? So put the onus back onto individual scientists. I'm going to take a third option, which is try and design a new practice which both preserves all the functions of authorship, unlike the first proposal, but also addresses their inconsistency, unlike the second proposal. Okay, so slightly facetiously, this gets associated with the kind of death of the author trope in literary studies, associated with Michel Foucault and Roland Barthes. And there's a kind of similar idea going on here, right? That we should get rid of the scientific author, but I think it's important that we put something in her place. Okay, so just a kind of like bit of intellectual history here. There's actually a long history of trying to get rid of an author and replace it with other things. So Bonaventure in the 13th century talks about the fourfold, so he's a scholastic theologian, talks about the fourfold ways of making a book and distinguishes between scribes, compilers, commentators, and authors, right? So there's a bunch of different ways of putting your name associated with a scholarly tome or work of theology, and not all of them are authorship. Right, so we've got this idea also in literary studies from Barthes and Foucault that there's a kind of hermeneutic death of the author, right? That in works of literature, we shouldn't be using the author to interpret a work of literature. But also within medical sciences, there's some interesting papers in the 90s associated with, particularly with Vrije, but the important paper is with Yank and Emmanuel called When Authorship Fails, which argues that we should replace the status of author with contributors and guarantors. So my proposal is going to build on that one and kind of take things a little bit further and motivate things with these general conceptual functions of authorship. Okay, so here's the proposal. So do away with authors on papers and replace it with 4 different statuses, right? So the first status is either contributor, the second of a writer, the third of a spokesperson, and the fourth of a guarantor. Okay, so here's a little description of these roles. So a contributor is someone who's, at least in part, credit-worthy for the discovery, the increment in scientific knowledge which has been made. A writer is someone who contributes to the writing of the project and takes responsibility for the sincerity, coherence, and consistency and knowledge norms. The spokesperson is someone who takes responsibility for the defend or retract norm. That's a little bit like a corresponding author. And the guarantor is someone who provides their credibility, is held accountable, and also expresses sincerity. So what we've done with this kind of explosion of authorship into different roles is taken the different conceptual functions of authorship and associated them with distinct statuses, right? So contributor answers to the credit function, the functions associated with constructing a speaker have been split up a little bit. So some of them are taken up by the writer role, some by the spokesperson role, and some by the guarantor role. Accountability is similarly split between the writer and the guarantor. The guarantor is kind of like, in a sense, like putting up their credibility for the whole result and then should be held accountable. But the research has been done by the people who are contributors. And there's going to be some important issues here about how all these different roles are kind of rewarded as well, so they're all incentivized. Okay. So one thing to say about this proposal is that it doesn't mean that every paper should have exactly 4 authors. There are ways of like allocating a set of people like multiply across these different roles, right? So we might have everyone be an author and also a writer, spokesperson, and guarantor. We could have some people being a contributor, some other people being a writer, and then the set of those also being spokesperson or guarantors. Or we could have kind of people who are just guarantors but not contributors. There's lots of ways of distributing roles here. Okay, and this is important because this is going to help us to resolve the 4 problem cases we talked about before. So in each of those cases, functions of authorship pulled in different directions. We can just resolve them by saying, in those cases, people should be contributors, but not writers, spokespeople, or guarantors. Okay, so I've just got a couple more minutes left, that's right, Euron. So a few, but stop me if I go over time. So some benefits of this proposal. So it clears up the problem cases because people can be listed as contributors, but not the rest of the roles. It's rather flexible. There are lots of ways of distributing these different roles. So it means it's able to represent a lot of different kinds of research cultures. It can also be used, kind of straightforwardly by just like reorganizing the byline and having these roles listed underneath the title of a paper, but it can also be useful in just clarifying what's at issue in authorship disputes, like what matters when people are disagreeing. It's important that it doesn't give a recipe for determining who should play which role for a particular paper, but my hope is that it allows people to at least be asking like coherent questions about what's at issue in authorship disputes. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to compare this proposal with the ICJME and contributor roles taxonomy proposals for regimenting authorship, and just kind of point out some ways in which the CSWG proposal has some like nice features. Okay, so the hopefully familiar ICJME guidelines, which originally came out of medical science, are a kind of regimentation of authorship. And they say that there are 4 conditions which are required for someone to be an author. So they better made substantial contributions, they better drafted the work or revised it, they better give final approval for the version to be published, and they've got to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So first point, looks like we're seeing these functions like pretty, the functions that I've talked about being expressed here, right? So the credit function, issues about writing consistency and coherence, approval and sincerity, and accountability. So good extra evidence for those functions being important for authorship. One real problem that happens with the ICJME guidelines is that they force a particular model of authorship onto lots of different kinds of research cultures, right? So basically, I think what they do is they take like the statuses associated with a single author and say every person who is a co-author has to have all of those features. And that means that it's not possible to have like some people who contributed and then other people who wrote the paper, and then other people maybe who didn't contribute who want to be held accountable because they say this is a really important result. I'm a big figure in this field, take my word for it. Okay, so there's something good about this proposal with conceptual clarity, but it's not as flexible as the proposal that I'm making. Just on the contributor roles taxonomy, so this is a proposal to supplement the byline with a description of who's done what in research. So there's a kind of, what do they call it, controlled vocabulary of different things which people have done in research, and people can list themselves under the different things that they've done. So it's both writing, but also a bunch of different kinds of research. 2 points to make about this proposal. It's not clear that this set of descriptions are going to apply to every kind of research that's been done. As a humanities scholar, as a philosopher, I'm like yeah, I don't know if I'd list myself in like any of these except for like conceptualization. So there's a question about how to make a description of research which applies to all disciplines. But also this proposal just deals with the allocation of credit, right? It doesn't deal with any of the other functions of authorship. So there's an important way in which it kind of only gets us part way towards representing the complexity of authorship. Okay, good. So what have I done today? So I've given you a bunch of functions associated with authorship. I said there's 5 of them. And I've said that there's some problem cases in which these functions get into conflict, and made a proposal, the CSWG proposal, which gives us a story about how authorship might be reformed in order to deal with those kinds of problem cases and make authorship more conceptually clear. Okay, so as Jeroen said at the beginning, this is a talk derived from a paper that's forthcoming in the British Journal of Philosophy of Science. If you're after references, that's a place to go to. And the proposal of the paper has been applied to its very paper. So on the first page of it, you'll see a version of the contributor spoke to right to guarantor proposal, where all of the people who've done really important credit-worthy work on this paper are contributed, but because it's me that wrote it up, it's me that's the spokesperson, writer, and guarantor. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. That was wonderful, very rich, subtle, historically informed. Thanks a bunch for that talk. So we have a bunch of questions coming in the Q&A, and if you still have questions, you can continue to ask them in the Q&A. So first one, someone who actually appears to be from the high-energy physics community, Jeff Templon. So he asks, the difference between spokesperson and guarantor, forget, is not clear to me. So in high-energy physics, we already have spokespersons. It's hard for me to imagine who the guarantors would be. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, good. So I've kind of slightly bracketed some of the complexities of the proposal because it gets kind of finicky. So just conceptually, the difference between a spokesperson and a guarantor is about like whose responses are. Go back on the slides. So the spokesperson is kind of pretty similar to a corresponding author, right? That's the person who takes responsibility for the defend or retract norms, so someone who answers questions about the paper and defends it in subsequent correspondence. Whereas the guarantor is the person who's putting themselves, person or group, who provides their credibility, is held accountable, and expresses sincerity for the claims that are made. So the guarantor could be someone who, both guarantor and spokesperson could be people who didn't contribute to the research at all. Like that's okay, as long as they're not listed as a contributor as well. But the spokesperson needn't be someone who believes the results, right? They're just someone who's like there to defend the results. Whereas the guarantor does need to believe the results and to kind of like be held accountable because they're putting their credibility up for the group. So just on high energy physics, I think this is an interesting case that illustrates something I haven't talked about, where it looks, at least to me, from the kind of science studies that I've read about the high energy physics community, that what happens is that the collaboration or the project plays the role of guarantor. The project puts up this kind of like institutional reputation to play the guarantor role, but one individual puts themselves up to play the role of spokesperson. So I'll just like caveat that a little bit. That would be like how I think you'd reconstruct the intellectual culture of high energy physics within the proposal. And I think that's kind of what's implicitly going on. So we've got a collective playing the role of guarantor and then an individual corresponding author playing the role of spokesperson, which kind of illustrates the general point that all of these roles can be played both by individuals and by collectives. I'd be really interested if that's also your sense of what's going on, because yeah, I defer to high energy physics researchers on their own intellectual culture.
All right, thanks, Josh. I mean, it might be tricky to follow this up through the online Q&A, but you guys can maybe get in touch through email later. We have other questions. So here's a question from Sovik Dasgupta on the responsibilities involved in authorship. So he gives an example. Oftentimes I've come across errors in data interpretation or faulty citations of previous papers, which I've pointed out to the corresponding authors. But in spite of doing that, in spite of the journal or the authors committing to publishing corrections, often nothing happens. So with whom does the responsibility to correct the record lie, do you think? And does your proposal say anything about that?
Yeah, this is a good question. So I think there's a way in which publishing in journals is like rather unlike talking in a conversation, right? Because you can change a position in a conversation, you can elaborate and make things clearer or put in more reasons or things like that. And there's a way in which kind of journal paper is just like, here's a static assertion and a set of reasons to support it. So one thing we might want to think about in research is the possibilities for like post-publication peer review, and then ways of like elaborating on or retracting, as Lex was talking about, but also like adding in extra reasons to a paper. So I think this is important. I'm not sure a kind of like a set of authorship guidelines would help us to deal with this, but maybe there's a way in which we can kind of unsettle the kind of published paper as this very static thing and allow for more changes post-publication within a controlled set of ways, just as you can on an archive, right? You can have controlled versions which change over time. Maybe that's important to have in published papers as well.
Right. So Josh, a quick thing, can you stop your screen sharing so people can actually see you a bit larger on their screens?
Absolutely.
Thanks. Great. So actually, Jeff responded to your earlier response to his question. So he suggests maybe perhaps our spokespersons are what you call guarantors. So that would maybe sort of get at what's going on or solve what's going on. A question from Tamarinde Haven. Where do peer reviewers fit into your proposal? Would peer reviewers be guarantors or something else?
Yeah, good. So there's kind of like two answers to that question. So there's one way in which like, if you're optimistic about the truth filtering functions of peer review, and I don't think we should be in general, like in some disciplines, maybe peer reviews reliable, maybe in other disciplines it's like not, or it's not its function, then kind of peer review itself plays some kind of guarantor role. But there's also roles which might be played by individual peer reviewers who, if you take this proposal, who could say to a journal like, oh, do you want to put me on as a guarantor of this paper? Like just as in books you have kind of author, what do you, I've forgotten the word. On the back of a book, you'll have people who are like, yes, this book is great, excellent, go read it. And you can kind of have those for academic papers as well. And maybe peer reviewers are the right people to do that.
Cheerleaders or blurb writers.
The blurb is the right word, yeah.
Cool. So a question about the legal side of things here from Stefan Thiel. If I'm an author, do I have the rights to intellectual property described in the paper? Does that follow, or do you think that's a good way to go?
This is just massively complicated, right? So an important bit of the history of authorship that I left out is that it turns out in the kind of historical record, our conception of authorship and the way authorship is dealt with happens through disputes about plagiarism and disputes about copyright, right? So there's a kind of way in which like there were first disputes about copyright, and then our conception of authorship like was formed through those set of disputes. So right, authorship is a kind of claim to intellectual property. All of those issues are just like super complicated, like legally and philosophically complicated. So I just haven't dealt with them here. That's like a really important issue for future research. And just in general for like co-authored research, like, yeah, there's a bunch of really difficult issues about how to think about copyright in these kinds of cases. And like whether copyright is doing useful things for collective inquiry or not. So yeah, super important set of questions. There's some really good work which is done by historians of science on these set of issues, and I'm blanking on the name of the author now, but there's lots of cool stuff out there.
All right, thanks. A question from Katerina Bayer. If the guarantor doesn't necessarily have to have contributed to the research or the project, how is she or he different from an honorary author, something that many authorship guidelines want to explicitly exclude?
Right, excellent. This question is dead on. Basically, these are honorary authors, but I'm trying to suggest kind of implicitly there's something good about honorary authors, right? So there's something bad about them too, right? So honorary authors are bad because like including them indicates they've done work which they haven't done, right? If you just put a senior scientist from the field in because that's going to get more people to read the paper, you've implied something false about who did research on the paper. But there's something good about that inclusion as well, right? Because it means that the paper might get taken exactly as seriously as it should be, given the right credibility assignment. And that's a useful thing for kind of the communication of results. So what I'm trying to do by distinguishing between contributor and guarantor is to allow for the good bit of honorary authorship, which is the making sure that the research is read by the right people, without the bad bit, which is kind of communicating false things about who did research. Now, this is going to mean that that role is going to need to be held like particularly accountable, so that people can't just like put themselves on as like guarantors on like loads of papers and then not allow themselves to be held responsible. But yeah, the question's dead on. I am trying to like regiment honorary authorship in a way that like keeps its good bits but gets rid of its bad bits.
All right, yeah, it's a delicate balance, I guess. So a question from Fahime Marafat. Nowadays, journals ask for a clear description of each individual's contribution. So, you know, this person did the conceptualization, this other person did the data mining, and so on and so forth. So each individual is held responsible for the section or the bits of the paper that they took care of. How does that fit with your proposal? Do you think it's essentially the same thing, or are there clear differences there?
So I think what I'm trying to do is to distinguish like the different kind of conceptual functions associated with authorship. So some of them are like forward-looking, as well as being like backward-looking, to do with who did what research. There's a question, but there's a big question here about like how a contributor's list should look. So on the list that I had, it was just alphabetical, but you could include with a contributor list like a contribution statement about who did what. You might want to split it into different kinds of roles. And there's just like a kind of whole set of options here. But like, there's difficult questions here, right? So like, is it useful to know who did what, or does that require researchers to both do a paper and then like basically write a paper about who did what in their research and then like not publish that, but use it to construct their contribution statement? I think in some cases that's going to be really useful, but in other cases it's not going to be really useful. One of the points about the high energy physics community is they've decided it's really not helpful for us to write contribution statements for all our papers. Like that effort doesn't give a kind of corresponding like benefit to the intellectual community. So we're just gonna list everyone. And I think disciplines should be allowed to go both ways, right? So just have contribution statements, contribution lists, which are alphabetical, or have like quite detailed descriptions of who did what.
Right. A question from Bert Segers. Suppose we take your proposal as sort of authorship 2.0 or maybe 3.0 or 4.0 in 2030. How do you see this becoming reality? What sort of specific or concrete steps would individuals, institutions, journals, etc., have to take to implement this?
Good. So as individuals, I think the thing that one can do is to like write better contribution statements, right? That's a thing which lots of journals allow you to do. They allow you to write like acknowledgements or contribution statements, and you can like think about, right, what's going on here? What am I doing in writing this? Am I just saying thanks to some people, or am I trying to construct something like this set of like contributor, speaker, writer, guarantor roles? And you can have that feed into how you write your contribution statement or your acknowledgement section. If you want to be a bit more chaotic, like I've done with this paper, you can say, oh, I want to list my byline in this kind of way on the first page of the paper, and you can do that. That kind of starts to put pressure on, or at least to like poke journals to kind of allow this kind of practice. And I think there's a kind of way in which it could emerge ground up, but some journals are going to need to get on board and at least allow this kind of proposal to go on. There's a way in which it's kind of radical, but it's also kind of not radical, right? Like a lot of things are going on kind of already, right? So the ICJME guidelines were already motivated by by the Vrije manual paper. So these kind of, lots of these ideas are kind of in the air, I think, for journal editors and publication ethics people. It's just the specific version is a different way to regiment the byline.
Right, good. So a final question before we break, and this is, asking for a friend. So where do you see this proposal going if it were implemented in the humanities, or maybe specifically philosophy, where single-authored papers are often still the norm?
Right. So here's my take on philosophy. Philosophy is almost never single-authored. What we just do is we put the writer on as the author, and we either leave out contributors or we put them in the acknowledgements. So what happens for a bunch of humanities disciplines is that we should be putting many more people in the acknowledgements and saying it's not just like thanking people, but these are people who contributed to the intellectual achievement of the paper in a bunch of different ways. So more people go in the acknowledgements, as I have in this paper, put a lot of people on the contributor list, and that acknowledgement section becomes not just kind of like something informal, but something that's really important to the scholarly record about like attributing credit for intellectual discovery.
Yeah, makes sense to me. All right, Josh, so thanks a lot for this. This was very, very stimulating, provocative even sometimes. So a virtual round of applause for you as well. To our audience, thanks also for contributing to a lively discussion. We'll break for coffee, tea, or whatever you prefer now, and we'll be back here at 11:15. Hope to see you again then.